Hey, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. So I'll start by introducing myself, if that's all right, and then I'll get on to David quickly. So my name's Harry Bulstrode. I do surgery for patients with Parkinson's disease and with brain tumours here in Addenbrooke's Hospital. And I also have a lab here at the Cambridge Stem Cell Institute focusing on stem cell biology in those conditions. And I'm introducing David today because we've been working with EG Technology for over a year now. On a new surgical device technology, and that's for local delivery of treatments into the brain. And we think it's going to be a real game changer. And that device is designed to allow rapid, safe local delivery of treatments to large volumes of brain tissue without reflux. And that's going to be key to cell replacement therapy in Parkinson's disease, which is a big area that Novo Nordisk and Bayer are already backing with billion-dollar valuations. And it could also be key to treating brain tumors and neurodegenerative disease and neurogenetic conditions. So a lot of potential applications for that. And we came originally with just an idea. We actually went to URI and to the Office for Translational Research team. And URI helped us to get funding. And with that, we went to EG Technology. And as I say, we came to them with an idea, and I'm used to NHS and university timescales, so I wasn't expecting anything to happen very fast. But I've been absolutely stunned and delighted with the progress that EG have made. Literally over weeks, we could see this coming on, and they really have a team of supremely talented engineers, and of course the wider team at the company. So with that in mind, it's a real privilege to introduce David Warwick. David is a director at EG Technology. He specializes in the compilation of technical files and dealing with regulatory requirements around CE marked and FDA approved medical devices. We've benefited from David's advice even at the very early stages of our project, and he's going to be absolutely key to our plans to get a Class 3 medical device into patients soon. I've got every confidence in his ability to deliver on that, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing what he has to say. So I'll stop sharing now and I'll hand over to you, David.
Okay, thank you very much, Harry. Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so thanks very much for the intro. Yeah, so in the talk today, I want to run through some of the challenges of translating your research into successful medical devices. The development of medical devices can be fairly complex, and it's potentially quite a daunting process. So in this talk, I want to share with you some of our experience and how we address the sort of spectrum of challenges and risks associated with that development program. We'll touch on things like identifying the user and thinking about those user requirements and product requirements. A bit more on how to leverage different prototyping techniques and when to do prototyping and testing throughout the program. A little bit towards the end about clinical trials and the distinction between clinical trials from a regulatory perspective versus what perhaps you might be more familiar with in an academic or healthcare kind of setting. And yeah, how all of those things sort of mesh together to hopefully give you a plan for a product development which is ultimately successful. So Harry introduced me very kindly, but yeah, I'm David Warwick. I'm one of the directors here at EG Technology. We're a Cambridge-based product design and engineering consultancy. I've personally worked in the medical sector for over 20 years. Original technical background in software engineering, but throughout my time in the medtech sector, I've spent an increasingly large amount of time focused on the regulatory aspects of product development and helping people from an engineering perspective make sure that their product is designed correctly to hit those regulatory requirements. And as EG Technology, I mean, we do a lot of work helping both startups and university spin-outs to make those early stage prototypes, make that transition from research through into a successful product launch. So this is just a quick slide. This is not a hard sell presentation. I'm hoping it is more educational than that. But here's a quick sort of slide deck of some of the projects that we've got involved in, everything from surgical equipment, lateral flow tests, in vitro diagnostic tests, dental equipment, patient warming, physiotherapy, sort of you name it, we've done it. And we have a really talented team of mechanical engineers, electronics engineers, software engineers, and human factors people who help to bring all of those things together and cover the all the aspects you need in a product development. I say that though, but it's important to take stock of where you are at the start of the journey. Most people are probably familiar with the general idea of product development and working through increasingly sophisticated prototypes to eventually get something into manufacture. But an integrated product development process, particularly in medical, isn't actually just about the engineering. It's about bringing together a team with all of the necessary skills to navigate you through to medical device approvals. So your real world experience is more likely to look something like this. There are going to be multiple strands of activity going on with some pretty complex interdependencies, really. Lining up all of these activities, working out what your critical path is, and using the correct advisors, the correct partners at the right time are one of the areas in which you can really make sure you're planning for success, because you need to appreciate that your development isn't going to be a straight line or a linear journey. All of these streams are interlinked. You want to hit and set key milestones throughout that journey. You need to make sure that you're building confidence with all of your stakeholders, particularly your investors. But at the same time, it's important to try not to be too much a slave to those milestones, particularly at the beginning of the process. There will be so much both technical and product-based uncertainty that you have, that you need to keep an open mind and need to be flexible. And there's because there's two kind of different approaches you can take, really. I mean, lots of people like to follow a sort of a fail fast kind of methodology, move through the early stages of development as quickly as possible, but understand that might actually lead to early failures and the need to adapt. Another approach is to be sort of right first time, so take a little bit more time, take a little bit more care, be cautious in your development approach, and that has value as well, because sometimes a cautious approach can lead to the correct outcome ultimately quicker. But ultimately, what you don't want to do is you need to be clear what you're trying to do and how fast you are trying to achieve things, because what you really don't want to do is fail slowly. This talk isn't going to cover all of the areas of product development. If you want to find out a little bit more, there'll be a little bit of time for some questions at the end, and my contact details are on the slide, which we're very happy to circulate. So please feel free to reach out to us if you do have any questions on anything that I either cover today or on any other areas of medical device development. So before we delve too much into prototyping and clinical trials, let's just reflect briefly on what the ultimate end objective is. The goal of this exercise is to develop a commercially successful product, and that means thinking about your end users and developing a product that they want to use. I'm going to touch a little bit more on user needs in just a moment, but the other important aspect specific to medical device development is that you need to achieve the appropriate regulatory approvals for your device so that you can sell it. So briefly, here's a reminder or a quick intro that medical devices need to be placed on the market in accordance with the applicable laws in the territories you're looking to sell into. In the EU, some of you have probably heard of the MDR or the IVDR. The US has a similar system of legislation embodied in the Code of Federal Regulations, but people often just talk about FDA approval. There's because of Brexit and the regulations that were enforced, it happens that our law in the UK is currently aligned with the slightly older MDD and IVD directives. The legislation, it keeps getting pushed back. I think there's still some things scheduled for this year, but don't be surprised if it keeps getting pushed further out. The most likely approach in the medium term is that we will probably end up with some small amounts of UK specific stuff, but broadly speaking, a recognition of trusted global regulators. So that's likely to include the US, Canada, Australia, and of course the EU. But actually, the message here today is that whatever the changes are, whatever we bring in the UK, it seems unlikely we're going to stray too far from the requirements of the other large global regulators anyway, because the overall global trend is actually towards closer alignment. So generally speaking, I mean, due to like the well-publicized delays and lack of capacity associated with CE notified bodies, it's worth bearing in mind, and I think you've actually heard on some previous talks, that lots of people are actually now heading to the US first. You certainly probably want to think about having a parallel application process in both of those territories. And because there is such an overlap between the different regulatory areas, the standards that you have to follow for development are largely the same. Actually, you don't need to get too bogged down in the detail of specific requirements for the FDA or specific requirements for the EU. There are regulatory consultancies who can help you with that, but actually 90% of what you're going to do is applicable to developing safe and effective medical devices, regardless of where in the world you're targeting as your launch market. And again, this is another slide. Don't read all of this slide. That isn't the point of it. What this slide does is it's some of the clauses from the medical device regulation. And what I've done is highlighted the number of times that the word risk appears within that text. And this is the nub of what I'm trying to get at, is the overall intent is the same the world over for all medical devices and all regulatory frameworks, and that intent is to really focus on the risks in the product. So let's just explore a little bit more briefly what we mean about that before we then start talking about prototyping more generally. So people probably know something about the different classifications of medical devices. I've put in this slide the kind of ad hoc method of classification you sometimes hear quoted. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this is not the descriptions actually used in the regulations, but thinking about it this way does enforce the idea that the medical device regulations have different categories of devices, and it's all about the risks inherent in that device, with a primary focus on the potential impact on the patient. And it's also not about whether you try and sort of overclassify or underclassify your device. We're not attempting to bend the rules here. It's actually about being accurate at the start of your development program, because in addition to the specific requirements that you're going to have to meet, the classification of your device kind of sets the tone for the level of rigor for your whole development program. So if you are at the early stages of development, you really ought to work out your device classification as early as you possibly can, and should work through the classification rules. The rules in the MDR or the IVDR are reasonably decodable, but again, you can get help with that process if you need to. They are generally straightforward, but can lead to some surprising results, and this is why it's really important to do towards the beginning of your development. So as an example, we've got two systems pictured here on the right hand side. They're both used to image the skin as tools to help detect skin cancer. The device at the top is class 1, and therefore you can self-certify. The device at the bottom is a class 2A device, and this is purely because it incorporates some infrared lighting to take a slightly different image. The classification rules include specific wording about non-visible light, and it doesn't actually matter that the intensity of this light is roughly the same as your TV remote control. the wording of the regulation is very clear. And that subtle change from a class 1 to a class 2A suddenly means that you need third-party assessment. That means audit by a notified body. If you've worked in or heard about anything going on in the medtech sector recently, you'll know that there are well-publicized delays throughout the EU for CE marking of medical device products, and that simple transition can easily cost your development 12 or 18 months worth of time. It's also worth noting, though, that if you take that class 1 device at the top of the screen, if you were to, for example, to add some machine learning to that device that automatically reviews the images, perhaps makes a determination as to whether to refer the patient for a follow-up, then that top device then falls under what is Rule 11 in the MDR, dictating that software that helps to guide clinical decisions is also a Class 2A device. So there's been no change in physical hardware, but your intended use has shifted and the claims you're making for your product have shifted to the point where you're providing diagnostic support and a higher degree of regulatory scrutiny is applied. So with that in mind, the point here is that device classification should help you think about your overall device safety and acceptable levels of risk. And standards and regulatory approvals are a part of the process that ensures you deliver a better product. There's no need to be frightened of them. There's people who will be frightened of them for you. If you adopt the right mindset for your development, everything flows from that. And following an established development roadmap, thinking about the risks early on and adopting an appropriate development pathway means that there shouldn't actually be any surprises by the time you submit for regulatory approvals. Another key point is that at some point, as legal manufacturer, you need to decide that your product is good enough. And this can actually be quite different from a research or perhaps an engineering mindset, where it's actually quite tempting to keep making iterative improvements. But remember, there's no such thing as completely safe or 100% effective. What you're trying to do with medical device development is balance the risk of using your device versus the current standard of care. And that's not the same as saying that you need to be vastly technically superior. So, for example, a product that provides better patient access with equivalent safety and efficacy, but perhaps through a much more cost-effective treatment, that can have a huge impact. The assessment of risks also varies according to situation. So the risk-benefit ratio for a high-risk surgical intervention, perhaps something like Harry is describing, in an otherwise difficult or terminal case, is very different to, say, the risk profile of going in for a routine X-ray for a broken bone. So you need to show that your device is clinically effective, but that's not the same as saying it has to be 100% perfect. And we'll come back to this point sort of a few times throughout the talk. So rather than focus on technical perfection, make sure you're asking whether you're improving on the standard of care. If the current standard of care is, say, 70% effective, then it could be that only a modest increase to 80% is still sufficient to demonstrate a clear benefit. And we've got no time to go into, but health economics comes into this as well. So as I mentioned earlier, if you can offer the same level of performance as the standard of care, but at a dramatically reduced price point or in a way that dramatically increases access, that's got substantial benefits and tips the scales in your favor. However, keep in mind that the opposite is also true. So a only modest increase in clinical performance with a very significant increase of cost, that's going to be a difficult sell into the market. So as we start to move towards thinking about prototyping, let's encourage you to adopt a risk-based approach to your medical device development. Let's take a more detailed look at some of the key aspects of that process, which should help ensure a smooth transition from research into a commercial product launch. The first key aspect is making sure you develop the right product. This slide is kind of scary, but is useful for making the point. Shifting the mindset from research mode to a focus on the steps you need to get a product launched is quite difficult. You need to design the right product for the right market, and sadly, many products that do launch still fail. So right at the beginning of your program, you need to really make sure you understand your market, because often the basic need for the technology is there, but it's the execution of the product that's wrong. And so gathering user insight throughout the development process, particularly at the early stages of development, can avoid costly mistakes. The most expensive product you have to develop is the one that you have to develop twice. So, be ambitious by all means, but also be realistic. Poor planning, poor risk management of the project often means you can run out of cash earlier than you anticipated. Understand what can be accelerated. For example, paying a bit more for expedited prototyping, and what can't. We'll talk a little bit more about clinical trials and regulatory approvals towards the end of the talk. If you can, try to avoid overpromising to any investors, but savvy, experienced investors will understand these risks, and if you can build a solid plan for them, then they're much more likely to accept that than anything that is either overly ambitious or overly pessimistic. It's also important to make sure you've got the right people around you. So acknowledge where you'd benefit from support, whether that's technical, regulatory, market strategy, health economics. Make sure all of those teams are talking to each other. If you think back to my earlier slide, all of these aspects are interlinked, and a fragmented team where the engineers go off and design something that the users don't want, or the health economics say isn't a viable product, can mean you accidentally create gaps within your internal team. Ironically, on this slide, I mean that it's less common that you get directly outcompeted. It's usually other aspects of the product development execution that turn them out to be the problem. So if you're tempted to try and shortcut any of these things, think carefully about what your competitors might be doing. Are you skipping some of the things that they're doing? Are they finding out what users really want for a really great product? Are they taking time to ensure that they've met the market need? So you know your technology, but be careful about making assumptions about what that product should be. This slide presents a really common scenario, and it is a quick case study of a client where we'd been asked to develop a diagnostic test. They'd come to us and they'd asked us if we could develop a handheld device with a screen for doing some testing in an A&E department to find out if somebody's had a heart attack. So we went and asked some users, what do you think about a small handheld point of care device? And discovered that, well, sadly, anything that's not nailed down to a desk in an emergency department walks out the door. And if it doesn't work out the door, then somebody pops it in their pocket and is merrily walking around the department with it, and nobody else knows that they've got it. And then you dig a little bit more and you realize, talking to clinicians, that actually I don't want to know the results of this test when I'm standing right next to the patient. I would rather find out the results of the test, think about how I'm going to present those results, and then go back and communicate them. And then you delve a little bit deeper, and it's things like, well, handheld device, maybe that's okay. Does it take batteries? Oh, we don't have any budget for batteries. We won't have any batteries in the department. It'll never get plugged in to recharge it. So that doesn't work either. And so from what seems superficially like a perfectly logical idea, let's have a handheld device for a diagnostic test. For a busy emergency department, it's actually much better to have a device that can be screwed down to a known position in a known room somewhere in the department. It's plugged into the mains, it's always there, it's always working, and everybody knows where it is. So you can imagine a scenario where the company has gone off and developed the product, and you get a long way towards the end before suddenly realizing that it's not quite the right product for that particular market. But bear in mind that, for example, in a GP's surgery, for example, the use case is potentially still very different. Is a GP going to get up on a patient, walk out the door and go down the corridor and do a test? Maybe, maybe not. But completely different use environment. So in our development process, we place a lot of emphasis on specifications, but this isn't for sort of bureaucratic regulatory reasons. Taking the time to get the specification as right as you can provides you with the foundation for your development. And it's also the starting point of the risk management process. And I deliberately said as right as you can, because it's also important to acknowledge that things can and will change. Specifications should help you understand how you're going to meet the applicable standards, but they're also an opportunity to express what the intended use of the device is, and how you're going to achieve the performance requirements that you've got by codifying those and defining what your device has to be able to do. You're also providing a basis on which you can test whether you've achieved that level of performance. But at an early stage of development, make sure you've allowed yourself some flexibility. Use those early specifications to help you develop your understanding of the device, and allow that to evolve. Keep in mind a kind of holistic view of the whole system before delving too far into the detail of a particular technical aspect. It can result in a kind of a not being able to see the wood from the trees type scenario. As the cartoon on this slide suggests, I mean, always keep in mind what the user really needs. So specifications are also a tool for developing a shared understanding of the product. They're a really useful way of uncovering what you do and don't know, and perhaps identifying requirements that are in conflict. So writing a specification helps ensure that you've got as much of a complete understanding as possible. Good example is something like the trade-off between battery life and the physical size of the device. So you want a handheld diagnostic device, but you want a battery life of 3 months. Well, you can do some basic calculations and determine that if the battery is going to be the size of a shoebox, because it has to be, because that's what battery chemistry tells you need in order to achieve the power density that you want, there's got to be a trade-off there somewhere. You have to decide which elements of your specification can be flexible to achieve the best compromise product that you can. So let's delve a little bit more into prototyping itself. The previous slides touched on the importance of knowing what you're aiming at the start of the development. This includes understanding the requirements of your users, and as far as possible, translation of those high-level requirements into statements that can be empirically tested. So as I've already said, remember that while formal testing against your requirements forms an important part of the final verification of a medical device, in the early stages of development, you want to maintain some flexibility. Don't be too worried about reviewing and adapting and refining your requirements through testing as you learn more throughout the development. So linking all of this together, another way of illustrating the development model shows how specifications, prototyping, and risk evaluation keep linking up throughout the development. At each stage, you're fine-tuning your product, checking it meets both the performance requirements you've set and the needs of your users, whilst all the time at least keeping in the back of your mind the regulatory requirements to be safe and effective, by assessing the risks and assuming you keep in mind that criteria of the benefits of your product outweighing the residual risks. Appropriate testing at each stage of the development process is how you provide objective evidence that you're meeting these criteria, and can be a vital source of learning. The value in testing is frequently understanding what doesn't work and then identifying those areas as areas for improvement. So prototyping is all about reducing development risk, answering the question, is this going to work? But as we'll explore over the next few slides, is this going to work isn't just an engineering question. Prototypes can be about evaluating much more than just raw technical performance. They can be used to assess ergonomics or other aspects of user acceptance, continuing to ensure that you're developing the right product for your end user. Developing commercial feasibility can also be key. I mean, early low volume prototyping is going to be significantly more expensive than the final cost in series production. But an early bill of materials can allow you to go out and get some indicative quotations for volume pricing, perhaps identify the key cost drivers in your product. So a prototype can allow you to progress from just a finger in the air guess at your manufacturing cost to progressively more accurate estimates. And having indicative quotes which show how your custom machine parts will drop from hundreds of pounds as a one-off to single pounds or even pence when they become injection molded is another way to give your investors confidence that the development is going to remain on track and deliver a market-ready product. Prototyping is, of course, an important part of the development process, and it has a range of purposes. In the early stages of development, prototypes actually help bring your idea to life. You might want to be testing subsystems or check whether the technology can scale from a finely crafted piece of research equipment to a small batch of devices with consistent performance. They demonstrate progress to your investors, which is also pretty key, and that hitting those milestones that unlocks the next round of funding is of course critically important to any early stage company. But they also allow you to get feedback from potential users as early as possible in the program. Later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, clinical prototypes become increasingly important. This might mean making small batches of devices within a controlled process, but still before you're at the scale where traditional higher volume manufacturing partners are interested, particularly because there could be a gap of many months or even potentially years between the production of those first clinical devices and achieving regulatory approvals and launch. So, over the years, we've established an extensive supply chain of suppliers and partners who can help with prototyping, pre-production, early stage manufacture, and then scale up. And it's worth leveraging those support networks because actually it's unlikely that you'll be using the same manufacturing partners throughout the development. Try and take advantage of companies with medical device experience who specialize in providing support at your current stage of development, and they are out there, and there are people who are looking to support you at each stage of your development. I've also touched on the idea it's easy to get locked into a cycle of trying to over perfect your specifications, theorizing about potential use scenarios rather than actually going out and finding out about them, or thinking too deeply about particular aspects of how your device might work. Sometimes it is useful, inappropriate in a prototype and more efficient to just try it and use that fail fast scenario I talked about earlier. They aren't necessarily about success, and they don't always move the design forward, or not in ways that you immediately think. They also can confirm development routes not to follow. Learning quickly what does and doesn't work and adapting accordingly can be just as valuable as success. SpaceX is a really good high-profile example of this, ignoring Elon Musk's politics for a minute. They get SpaceX celebrate their failures because each time something goes wrong, it's an opportunity for them to learn, adapt, and improve for the next time. As I've already discussed, prototyping is about answering questions, but until you're into the later stages of development, a single prototype is unlikely to answer all of the questions that you have. It can help to be clear in advance about the purpose of your next round of prototyping. What are you hoping to achieve? What are you hoping to learn? Very often in the early stages, prototypes are based on technology development, but dummy looks like prototypes can also serve their purpose in either gaining early stage user feedback or building investor confidence. As you refine your development in later stages, your prototyping emphasis might shift. So having proven technical feasibility, you might be looking more towards maturing the design ready for clinical trials, or ensuring that commercial requirements for volume and pricing can be met within the design. As well as being clear internally on the objectives and maturity of your prototypes, we find it can be really important to ensure clear language and setting of expectations for all of your products. project stakeholders. In this respect, the sophistication of modern prototyping techniques and 3D printing, 3D rendering tools can actually create their own challenges. It can be very easy to show images or create superficial prototypes which overstate the completeness of the development process. This can be particularly true for medical device development, where the later stage prototypes need to go through regulatory assessment. You may need to conduct clinical evaluation, and those aspects of medical device product development take a long time. And so actually the point at which you're technically complete and have confidence in the capabilities of your product might only be halfway in your journey through to actually launching a commercial product into the market. The images on the slides here are, I suppose, intended to sort of reinforce that. This is an internal project we did for an enuresis monitor. We did lots of beautiful renders of the product for a website. We made some lovely caseworks that were beautifully painted and absolutely look like the renders from the outside, and then you open the case and it's just a dev board with a whole bunch of wires hanging off it. It's smoke and mirrors. The risk is that people like your investors see those renders and go, brilliant, you're done. Can I start selling it next week? This slide is really just some images of another client that we've worked with, starting with perhaps more familiar early stages of bench prototyping, completing proof of concept development work, progressively getting more mature in terms of what the prototypes look like and how they behave, until the point that you're able to put together instruments, which in this case were for research use, that could be manufactured in modest volumes for running lots more tests out there in the real world in commercial laboratories. Having talked about user needs, specifications and prototypes, one of the main reasons we do all this is to get to the point that you're able to test your device. So when talking about medical device testing, we tend to talk about verification and validation. The medical device regulations are also concerned about these different perspectives on testing. So verification is checking that you've done it right, that the product performs as you set out to in the product requirements. Generally speaking, this is empirical testing. Are the measurements accurate? Are they repeatable? Does the device work consistently and reliably? Validation, on the other hand, is checking that you've designed the right product for your end user, which tends to be much more subtle. In the context of the regulations, it's about confirming that the product does what the user needs it to do in a way that they can understand and can operate safely. And so actually we come all the way back to the user. Validation includes undertaking real-world assessments to confirm that you've designed a product that works for your end user. And actually, when you think about it, and another point I want to emphasize is that's not only a requirement of the regulations, it's a requirement for a successful product. Users are going to adopt products and technologies and devices that make their lives easier and resolve the needs, deficiencies, or limitations that they have with the status quo. So when I was talking about risks earlier, I noted that you don't necessarily need to be striving for perfection. A launch product and achieving your first regulatory approvals is a major company value and investment inflection point. Getting a device onto the market also tends to coincide with a significant uptake in the number of people using your product, and can continue to highlight areas for improvement and optimizations that still don't necessarily come to light during well-controlled clinical trials. It's not uncommon for startups to try and reach that inflection point as quickly as possible because it's so valuable, and that's okay. In fact, it's probably preferable to have a product roadmap that sees you following up with a V2 update once you've proven initial demand for your product. It's much easier to raise funding for that V2 development because so much of that early stage development has already been de-risked. As always, the pursuit of a first product launch as quickly as possible comes with a note of caution. Make sure you've given sufficient focus to the viable part of minimum viable product. Although your initial customer base will quite possibly be small. These are the enthusiasts and the early adopters who will eventually become some of your most important evangelists. As I've stressed throughout, your MVP still needs to meet the needs of those customers and provide them with a product experience that rewards them for taking a plunge with a new product. For reasons I've already touched on, there could be some resistance to making that leap from launching the first minimum viable product. I'd argue that each of these concerns are actually looking at the problem from almost exactly the opposite or the wrong perspective. So, for example, far from putting the R&D team at risk, starting to make money provides a revenue stream that allows you to continue development, start working on those V2 enhancements. Investors won't let you stay in the R&D phase forever. It is scary putting your innovation out there for the world to see and for customers to criticize, but think about how far you've come. And it's something that if you get to that milestone, you should be exceptionally proud of. Launching a product in any market is a massive achievement, but in medical, it's absolutely outstanding. Product commercialization, sales, marketing, managing a business, they are a long way from the world of research and academia, but you don't have to do it all alone. If your passion is still your research, that's okay. There are people out there whose passion is sales, their passion is marketing, they're really interested in finance. This is a team game. So as you're going through the development cycle, recruit good people or find good partners with complementary skills and enthusiasm. Successful companies don't try and force their founders into doing the things that they don't want to do. They keep them focused on the things that they do best. There's always that risk of failure, but the risk of failure is mitigated by taking the right steps throughout the development process and ultimately prove the market that you have prove that you can get your product out there on the market. The very final part of this talk, I want to briefly touch on clinical trials and the difference between academic research and regulatory testing, because it's quite important. Because they're used to, or people in those institutions, you guys are used to conducting research, we often see healthcare and academic institutions misjudge the work that's required for a formal regulatory clinical evaluation. That's partly because there are specific exemptions for institutions to conduct trials research. Clinical regulatory evaluation to the standards is actually based on demonstrating safety and efficacy. It's not about proving the science. Essentially, research work is permitted to be conducted subject to ethics approval, but these are often smaller studies. They often have a specific scientific intent. From a regulatory approvals perspective, the important point is that research studies aren't permitted to have a direct commercial intent. You aren't allowed to gather evidence for a regulatory approval via the back door of an academic research study. But what you can do is use those research studies as part of your portfolio of testing prior to formal clinical evaluation, so that you enter that final stage with the highest possible level of confidence that you're going to get the results that you need. So we need to think back to that product development timeline that I introduced at the start of this presentation and think about what some of those inputs to the final stage of regulatory approvals looks like. What is the development roadmap for preclinical and clinical data, and some of the key stages and standards that you need to be considering throughout your development? Another way of putting this very logical question is, how do I know that my device works without having to go through a long and expensive development process, only to find out at the very end I've got a problem? But the answer to that is really that at the different stages in the process, you're trying to demonstrate different things. A clinical trial to demonstrate safety and efficacy isn't the same as fundamental research into the core principles of a new technology. Generally speaking, you want to try and establish that much earlier in your development program, and then be expecting that your clinical trial for safety and efficacy is going to succeed. So you want to maximize your chances of success in that clinical trial by doing everything you possibly can in the lab first. Check that your device works reliably and consistently. in a test environment, because the last thing you want to do is start an expensive and time-consuming clinical trial for data to be lost because of something that you could have tested in a much lower cost, lower risk environment. Another strategy is to think carefully about how and when to gather test data and whether that forms part of your research program to prove technical capability or part of a formal clinical evaluation to demonstrate safety and efficacy. Do you actually need to conduct a clinical trial using the formal definition, or can data legitimately be collected by other means? So here's a couple of examples. One is a system that we helped develop for delivering oxygen synchronized with the breath. The way that this would be tested clinically is typically to do a cardiopulmonary exercise test, which is typically running on a treadmill, walking on a treadmill, or some light exercise on an exercise bike. But actually, it's exactly the same as an FTP test on a smart trainer, and anybody familiar with cycling will probably have heard of that term before. So you can do an awful lot of testing on healthy volunteers. You can do all of the development of that breath detection algorithm on healthy volunteers, just breathing medical air. That doesn't even need to be a clinical trial. It doesn't even need to be conducted within a clinical setting. And so you can have so much of that technical development done before you then move into the much more tightly controlled arena, which involves patients' ethics approval. Thinking about the problem from a slightly different perspective, we've also helped a client with a teledermatology product. Teledermatology is well established. What happens is you have some images of suspect moles taken, they get uploaded to the cloud, and a consultant dermatologist logs on and takes a look at that and makes a decision based on the digital image whether to refer you into secondary care. The cunning thing there, and there's more than one company in the market doing this, is that they have everything within that system, which is already out there on the market making money, to train an AI system to do what the clinician is currently doing. They have images being uploaded to the cloud, which are of a well accepted clinical grade of image. They have a diagnosis for every single one of those images from an acknowledged clinical expert. And they're busy making money from that, while all the time gathering larger and larger data sets, which they can then use as part of training the model. So again, there's different ways to approach this, which don't necessarily mean that you need to immediately embark on expensive clinical trials. So there's two key things to be aware of. Firstly, make sure you're clear about the distinction between a research study and the formal definition of a clinical evaluation in the context of regulatory approvals. The term clinical trial is used colloquially throughout the medical sector, but the purposes can actually be very different. Secondly, keep in mind that formal clinical evaluation occurs towards the end of the development program and needs to be conducted on devices that are extremely close to production intent. This final testing can add significant timescales to your overall development plan after you've finished the engineering work. So to make sure you've de-risked this final critical activity, which is focused on safety and efficacy for the patient, not technical performance, make sure that you've done all the testing you possibly can to prove and de-risk the technical aspects beforehand. And that is kind of me done. I haven't got quite as much time for questions as I was hoping for, but never mind, there's still a little bit there. Yeah, so that sort of summarizes it really. Yeah, make some plans at the beginning, think about the development process, and think about particularly user needs and the risks of your device all the way through, and basically make sure you're planning for success. We have a couple of useful resources on our website, which you're very welcome to access. One is looking at technology readiness levels, but it's looking at that across the whole range of the product development lifecycle and product development activities, not just from an engineering perspective. The other thing is that product development plan that I put up towards the beginning of the talk, we have an interactive version of that on our website as well, which you might find useful. And my contact details are also there. I think these slides are available to anybody who wants them afterwards. Thank you very much.